Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. The comfortable fairy tale says that capitalism had a rough patch in 2008, then recovered, and now just needs a bit more innovation, a bit more digital magic, and everything will somehow balance out. The reality is simpler and nastier. The global economic engine is running on a model that requires endless expansion, while the planet, people, and markets are already fully occupied. For an ordinary person, this doesn't look like a theory. It looks like a slow, stubborn decline. Lower real wages, more debts, shrinking security, and a middle class that quietly discovers it was a temporary privilege, not a permanent status. Right at the core of this story sits one number that nobody in Washington or Brussels likes to say out loud. By 2008, the average American household owed around 130% of its annual disposable income. For most of US history, this number never rose above 60%. That's not normal noise. That's a system eating its own future. And this is where the official story starts to fall apart. Now here is the part that keeps economists awake at night. We've already seen this movie before. We live in a strange moment where history is both repeating and doing something completely new. The speed of change keeps rising, but the pattern underneath is familiar. If you want a structural template, you don't look at the last crisis in 2008, you look at the late Soviet Union.
In the 1980s, the socialist bloc ran into a hard economic wall. Not потому что плохой социализм, а потому что модель развития была та же самая, что и на Западе – углубление разделения труда и постоянное расширение рынков. The USSR in the world economy functioned like one giant state corporation. No internal competition, планирование, но по сути та же логика, что и в транснациональных корпорациях. For a while, it worked brilliantly. After the war, when the Soviet sphere expanded, growth rates hit absurd numbers, up to 15% per year. When Khrushchev said in 1960 that by 1980 people would live under communism, it wasn't pure delirium. He extrapolated those growth rates for 20 more years. On paper, the math checked out, then physics intervened.
From 1961 onward, Soviet growth started to fall, not из-за ленивых людей, а из-за очень простой вещи. Возможности расширять рынки и систему разделения труда были исчерпаны. In Soviet language, this showed up as declining fund returns, but nobody could fix it because it wasn't a policy problem, it was a structural boundary. By the early 1980s, growth had drifted to zero. Right around the death of Brezhnev, the system stopped expanding. In short, the math didn't care about ideology. When growth stalls in a system that needs expansion, politics inevitably begins to rot. The state still needs more resources to solve rising problems, but the economic base has stopped growing. From there, you know the ending. Delegation games, internal conflicts, legitimacy loss, collapse. Now here's where the story stops making sense if you only listen to mainstream narratives. If you look at the United States and the global economy over the last 20 years, roughly since 2000, the picture is depressingly similar. Growth rates fall, the efficiency of capital investment falls, the cost of credit is pushed down step by step just to keep the machine moving. In 1981, the Federal Reserve's policy rate was about 19%. By the end of 2008, it was effectively zero. That is not smart policy. That's the system screaming that the old model has stopped working. And in Germany, the supposed industrial anchor of Europe, deposit rates even went negative, minus 0.2% at one point. If your savings cost you money, and yet official statistics keep telling you the economy is growing, you don't need a PhD to smell the gap between data and reality. In short, the headline numbers say recovery, but the price of money says terminal phase. Now, if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. Both the Soviet bloc then and the Western bloc now run on the same underlying logic, expansion of a division of labor system until it hits the physical limits of markets, territory, and demand. When that limit is reached, the label on the system doesn't matter anymore. Let's rewind the theory, but without university jargon. Classical political economy saw this problem early. Adam Smith already described the idea: in a closed system, economic growth cannot continue forever. It was an abstract thought experiment for him. He lived in a world where there was still land to grab, markets to open, and colonies to build. Karl Marx took that logic and pushed it further. If the planet is finite and capitalism needs expansion, then when the whole globe turns into one integrated system of division of labor, expansion stops and the system enters a structural crisis. For Marx, in the mid-19th century, this was also theory. Reality still had British, German, American, Japanese, Russian empires expanding, colliding, and rearranging themselves. Before the First World War, the world had at least 5 separate systems of division of labor: British, German, American, Japanese, and Russian. After the Second World War, there were 2, the Western American-led and the Soviet. They could grow at each other's expense. After 1991, that ended. One system remained, the global dollar-centered order. Politicians promised that was the end of history. Structurally, это было начало конца модели. Now, here is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. A single global division of labor system has nowhere left to expand. It can only grow via financial leverage by pulling future demand into the present through debt and asset bubbles. That works for a while. Then you wake up with a mountain of obligations that your real economy cannot service. That's where we are. At this point, the story takes a deliberate detour because mainstream economics did something clever and suicidal. It refused to think about the end of capitalism. In Soviet political economy, the topic was blocked for one simple bureaucratic reason. The version that traced crisis to exhaustion of external markets was developed by Rosa Luxemburg, who publicly argued with Lenin. Arguing with Lenin was not encouraged, so that branch was buried. In the West, the reason was most straightforward. The idea that capitalism has a structural endpoint did not amuse capitalists. Instead of engaging with the problem, they financed an alternative discipline, economics, as distinct from classical political economy. The key difference is not in formulas, it is in what you are allowed to think about. In economics, there is no end of capitalism. The system might have cycles, shocks, frictions, but the long-term existence of the framework is treated as given. If you kept the discussion at macro level, the contradictions would surface anyway, so the discipline migrated down into microeconomics, firms, households, marginal utilities, partial equilibria. In short, the intellectual plumbing was redesigned so you never have to discuss the size of the pipe. The result is almost comical. Since 2008, the world has lived in a chronic crisis of demand, debt, and productivity. Over the following 11 years, the most prestigious economic prize was handed out every year. Not one of those awards went to work that seriously engaged with the structural crisis of the model itself. The high priests of the system refused to discuss the one problem that determines everything else. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV. So where does that leave us now? Think back to 1991. When the socialist system collapsed, the direction was at least clear. There was a winner model, Western capitalism. For Eastern Europe, the script was straightforward. Join the victorious system, integrate, get access to credit and markets. Poland did this better than most. Others like Georgia or Ukraine stumbled hard and still haven't stabilized. But there was a visible destination. Today there is none. We are watching the dominant system itself hit the wall that Marx described in theory and that the USSR hit earlier in practice. There is no ready-made alternative blueprint waiting in a drawer. The classic Marxist script doesn't work because his main actor, an industrial proletariat with the scale and political weight of the 19th century, barely exists anymore. The social structure is completely different. So we face a structural endgame with no agreed replacement and with a political class that cannot honestly say, here is where we're going. Now, here is where the story stops making sense if you only look at it through official forecasts and glossy reports. Let's drop down from theory to concrete mechanisms. In 1981, the United States switched to a model that you can loosely call Reaganomics, stimulating demand through debt and finance. Instead of expanding markets by conquering colonies or building new industrial regions, the system expanded credit. Take a simple example, jeans. Before offshoring, a pair of jeans was produced inside the US for roughly $100. $96 of that was cost, $4 was value added, the contribution to GDP. When production moved to China, the cost dropped to around $4. The sale price in the US fell to $20 and the value added jumped to $16. Roughly $4 stayed in China as profit, still 100% margin for the manufacturer, and the remaining $12 went to American intermediaries, importers, logistics, retail. In short, the same physical jeans now generated 4 times more recorded value added inside the US. GDP liked it. Wall Street liked it, consumers liked it, because for the same $100 they could now buy 5 pairs of jeans or 1 pair and use the remaining $80 to service a credit on some gadget. Retail became one of the largest employers in the country. On paper, everybody wins. But there was a hidden side. Jobs in actual production disappeared. People were pushed into services, into retail, into endless layers of intermediation. To keep demand from collapsing, the system flooded households with debt. Historically, the average US household carried debts of up to about 60% of its annual disposable income. After 1981, that ratio exploded. By 2008, it hit roughly 130%. At that level, an average household cannot honestly service its obligations. Here is that number, and this is why it matters. Now, here is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. Once you reach that level of leverage, lowering interest rates doesn't restart healthy growth. You're not financing new productivity, you're just keeping an overextended balance sheet from imploding. Europe chose a slightly different path, but the logic was the same. In the US, the middle class was sustained by private debt. In the EU, especially in the core and in the new member states, the middle class was sustained by public debt and transfers, state borrowing, EU funds, regional programs. The surface story was integration, convergence, cohesion. The underlying mechanism was redistribution financed by future taxpayers. So what is this famous middle class in structural terms? It is not a moral category, it is a consumption pattern. Separate housing, not just a room in a communal flat, a car for the family, sometimes a car for each adult, a TV in every room, then a computer, then multiple devices, regular holidays, predictable services, a feeling of safety about savings and property. From 1981 onward, in the countries that adopted demand stimulation through debt models, the share of population with this pattern of consumption exploded. More than half of society became middle class in this sense. And all political messaging, all marketing, all mass media were redesigned around this target audience. In short, the political system bet everything on a subsidized middle class. Now ask a simple question: what happens when the subsidy ends? This is the moment the crisis stops being abstract. When the middle class loses its subsidy, it doesn't just downgrade a holiday, it loses the lifestyle that defined its identity. The car becomes too expensive to maintain, the mortgage becomes a trap, the second child becomes a financial risk. You can lower consumption if you are poor. You already live in survival mode. For the subsidized middle class, the loss is existential. It feels like theft. And this is where the theory meets a brick wall. The political systems in the US, in Western Europe, and in China have no practical experience managing a long, steady decline in living standards. In Eastern Europe, Russia, and Japan, this story already happened. People there have lived with stagnation or decline for decades. It is unpleasant, but societies adapted. The West has not gone through that adjustment yet. When it does, the shock will be political, social, and psychological. If you're watching this from Germany, you already see the early stage: falling trust in traditional parties, internal fights inside grand coalitions, constant scandals around banks and deficits. If you're in Southern Europe, you know how it feels when temporary austerity quietly becomes permanent. In short, we are heading into a world where more than half of society discovers that their status was rented on credit, not owned. Now, let's talk about incentives, because systems don't move by speeches, they move by who gets paid. From the early 1980s, the dominant beneficiaries of the model have been finance and the actors who manage and protect it. The entire liberal revolution, deregulation, freedom of capital, privatization, was not an abstract moral project. It was a reconfiguration of power in favor of those who control money emission and credit allocation. In such a framework, conservative institutions that limit the influence of finance become targets. The family is a prime example. A strong family with conservative values tends to distrust usury and speculative finance. Traditional religious systems directly restricted or condemned interest. You can see it explicitly in conservative forms of Islam, where usury is banned. Historically, this created a natural friction between moneylenders and family-based social structures. From the early 1980s onward, as financial capitalism took the driver's seat, we see a systematic cultural and legal attack on conservative institutions: family, church, local community. Simultaneously, we see an explosion of identity politics, lifestyle liberalism, and narratives that fragment society into individuals and microgroups, each addressed directly by the market and the state, instead of being shielded by family structures. Officially, this is all framed as rights and freedom. In practice, it behaves like a subsidy pipeline to the financial sector. People without strong family buffers are more dependent on credit, more exposed to shocks, more controllable. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV. Here comes the paradox. The very model that inflated the middle class via debt now destroys the conditions that made it governable. The subsidized middle class needs a strong state to protect its property. A poor person has little to lose. A rich person can hire private protection and lobbyists. The middle strata rely on public institutions to guard their flat, their savings, their pension claims. In exchange, they tolerate bureaucracy, taxes, and regulation. As long as the state delivers stability and rising consumption, the deal holds. When the state can no longer deliver growth, but continues to cooperate with finance to squeeze the same middle class, the legitimacy evaporates. You see the problem here, right? After the crisis fully unfolds, the huge mass of people who grew up as middle class will start sliding down. Their previous life will not be postponed. It will be cancelled. That is not just an economic shock, it is a psychological trauma. Nobody knows how Western societies will react when that realization sinks in. To understand the scale, it helps to look at historic analogies. In Europe, over the last 2,000 years, there have been only two crises comparable in depth. The first was the transition from the antique world to feudalism between roughly the 3rd and 8th centuries. The second was the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the 16th and 17th centuries. In both cases, production collapsed. Metal smelting, the size of fleets, even the number of cattle grazing on fields fell by about a factor of 10 in the worst phases. For people inside those transitions, it felt like the end of civilization. It wasn't, it was the end of one economic order and the violent birth of another. That's the scale of what we are walking into now. Not the end of humanity, but the end of a specific economic mechanism. Now, here's the part that keeps economists awake at night. This time we enter that transition with nuclear weapons, global information networks, and tightly coupled supply chains. The margin for error is smaller. Let's briefly touch on geopolitics, because every structural economic crisis invites the question, will this end in a big war? A large war requires at least two comparable independent systems that can collide. Before 1914 there were several: British, German, American, Russian, Japanese. After 1945 there were two, the Soviet and the Western. Today in structural terms there is only one, the global dollar-centric system. You cannot have a real world war between the right leg and the left hand of the same organism. You can have local conflicts, internal breakdowns, proxy wars on the periphery, but not a symmetric global confrontation between fully independent systems. For that to happen, the current world economy would first have to split into regional currency and production zones that see themselves as separate centers of power. You can imagine a Eurozone, an East Asian zone around China, a Eurasian zone around Russia, a dollar zone, maybe an Indian zone. After that fragmentation, over decades, conflicts between these blocs become structurally possible. In short, the danger is real, but it is not tomorrow morning. The more immediate risk is chaotic fragmentation, not a clean scripted world war. Now, let's talk about the role of the state in all this, because the fashionable line for 30 years was the market will solve it. If the world really does split into regional systems, only states have the tools to reassemble integrated, self-sufficient clusters out of the debris of the global order. They will have to rebuild industrial chains, guarantee minimal social stability, and draw hard borders around financial and trade regimes. In some zones, this will mean tighter state control, in others more room for private initiative, but everywhere the relative weight of the state will grow. Not потому, что политики хорошие, а потому, что никто, кроме государства, не может администрировать падение уровня жизни без полного развала. Now, here is the quiet part, said out loud. That shift implies a reversal of the liberal revolution of 1981. The social role of the family will have to grow again simply because you cannot hold the society together when the middle class is shrinking and conservative buffers are destroyed. The same elites that spent 40 years attacking traditional structures will be forced back toward them just to survive the turbulence. Does this look like a strategy from your corner of Europe, or just managed decline with improvised patches? We also need to say a few words about fashionable distractions like digital currencies. There is a lot of mythology around digital money, as if it were a new civilization in a chip. Structurally, the story is more modest. During the collapse of the current dollar-centric system, digital currencies can be used as temporary tools to route around sanctions, to move value between jurisdictions, to sterilize excess national liquidity, to experiment with new control mechanisms. But once regional fiat currencies consolidate euro, yuan, ruble equivalent, rupee, dollar, states will react predictably. They guard their tax base and monetary sovereignty jealously. Any parallel systems that seriously threaten that control will be pushed to the margins, regulated to death, or absorbed as mere technical layers under the existing currency regimes. In short, you can't replace real production, food and energy with blockchain. People don't eat tokens and don't eat flats with smart contracts. This is the structural flaw you can't fix with a press release. Let's briefly come back to the micro level, because in the end the crisis is lived by households, not equations. For a family in the US or Western Europe, the model of the last 40 years was simple. You borrow against future income, you upgrade your lifestyle to middle-class standards, and you expect the system to keep growing so that the debt burden becomes lighter over time. That logic is now broken. Debt burdens are heavy, real wages have stagnated. In the US, average wages in purchasing power terms sit near levels last seen in the late 1950s, and the capacity to stimulate demand via more credit is exhausted. Households are already highly leveraged, so what happens when interest rates start rising from artificially low levels? Instead of buying more, people are forced to direct cash flow to servicing old obligations. Demand falls, companies cut back, tax revenues shrink, and the very debts that were supposed to be serviced become even harder to pay. If you work in manufacturing or energy, you've seen this movie before. You know how it ends with capacity cuts, layoffs, and fire sales of assets. Now extend that logic from your factory or your grid to entire countries. That's the trajectory we're on. If you're sitting in Eastern Europe or the Baltics, the picture has an extra twist. Countries like Poland or Lithuania already went through a brutal adjustment in the 1990s. Industries collapsed, living standards fell, and only later did EU integration and funds give a partial recovery. That funding phase is not eternal. When transfers from Brussels shrink and the core of Europe itself enters decline, the periphery will not be shielded. For small states on the edge of larger blocks, the strategic question is no longer how do we climb one more step inside the current system. The real question becomes which regional system do we want to attach ourselves to when the current one fragments. The uncomfortable answer is that nobody has a complete blueprint. Not in Brussels, not in Washington, not in Beijing. Now, here is where the story stops making sense. If you expect adults in the room, most of the political class is still selling the same line, a bit more of the same, and growth will return. They do not have a worked out plan for a post-capitalist order. So what does all of this mean for young people, the generation that will actually live through the structural transition? Unlike older elites, they are not heavily invested in the ideological battles of the 20th century. They don't carry the same reflexes about capitalism versus socialism. In theory, that gives them an advantage. They can look at the system with clear eyes. In practice, they are often undereducated in the basics of political economy and drowned in propaganda about freedom and democracy that has little to do with how the monetary plumbing works. If there is any rational advice here, it is brutally simple. Learn how systems actually function, how money is created, how supply chains are built, how energy systems keep societies alive, how states react when resources shrink. Because the people who will design the next order are not those who memorize slogans, but those who understand constraints. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. We are not facing a moral drama of good versus evil. We are facing a structural collision between an expansionist economic model and a finite planet. So let's take a breath. Where does this leave us so far? We have a global system built on endless expansion, already pressed against the limits of markets and debt capacity. We have a middle class that was artificially inflated by credit and is now being squeezed. We have political elites that don't dare admit the scale of the problem. And we have no consensus about what the next system should look like. And this is the real price tag of the convenient lie we started with, the story that capitalism could globalize once and then somehow keep growing forever inside a closed shell. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones and try to remember, slogans don't power grids, systems do.